Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more The Massacre at El Mozote. Today we are getting into it here with Chapter 9, Unearthing the Truth of El Mozote. So let's go ahead and hop into this. Monterosa was 5 years dead before the exiles returned to Morazan, crowded into the trucks and houses that came over the mountains, or trucks and buses that came over the mountains from the Honduran refugee camps. They flooded back into the deserted villages and hamlets of the Red Zone. The Salvadoran government could do nothing to stop them, for it was November 1989, and across the country the guerrillas had unleashed a general offensive that, in the political shock it provoked, would turn out to be the Salvadoran equivalent of Tet. It would put an end to the long civil war. The fighting was especially brutal in San Salvador, where guerrillas dug themselves in the crowded slums, and the military managed to extract them only by bombing and strafing civilian neighborhoods. But the turning point of the offensive and of the war itself came during the early hours of November the 16th, when commandos scaled the back wall of the shady campus of the University of Central America, roused 5 Jesuit priests from sleep, ordered them to lie with their faces against the ground, and emptied automatic weapons into their brains. Before they departed, the soldiers killed a 6th priest, the Jesuit's cook, and her 15-year-old daughter. The scene they left behind had obliterated skulls of priests, the green lawn soaked in blood and brains, and fantastically redundant number of spent cartridges. Was one of spectacular carnage. And though the soldiers made a half-hearted attempt to scrawl a few leftist slogans, it would very shortly become clear that those who had done this work were the men of the Atlacatl. It was the enormous political blunder, for it said to the world, and especially to the Americans in Congress, that the billions and billions of dollars and all the fine words about training and reform at bottom of the Salvadoran army remained what it had been at El Mozote. But by now Ronald Reagan had gone, and so had the ideological threat he had so feared. The time had come to bring the war to an end. In the mountains of Morazan, in what was still the Red Zone, the refugees built their community. In the Honduran camps, they had made friends among the international aid workers, and now, with help from the European community and other agencies, they raised up new buildings of straight down planks, a shoe factory, a handicraft shop, a nursery to hold the children during the day when the people went to work. And they named their community Segundo Montes, after the following Jesuits. On October the 26th, 1990, Pedro Chicas Romero of La Joya who had hidden in a cave above the hamlet as the soldiers killed his relatives and his neighbors, went down to San Francisco Gotera and filed a criminal complaint with the court of the first instance, accusing the Atlacatl battalion of responsibility for the killings in El Mozote and the villages around it, and asking that Judge Federico Ernesto Portillo Campos investigate and punish those responsible. Among the first witnesses to give testimony in the case was Rufina Amaya Marquez. The investigation proceeded haltingly, and although Tutela Legal, among other human rights organizations, tried to push the judge forward by publishing in November of 1991 the first full investigation of the El Mozote massacre, including the names of 794 dead. It is hard to know what might have come of it had not the government of President Alfredo Cristiani and the commandants of the FMLN come together in Mexico City in January 1992 and signed an agreement to end the 12-year-old war. Among other things, an agreement provided that the army be purged of known human rights violators and reduced by half, that the guerrillas disarm and some of their number join a new civilian police force, and that the Atlacado and other rapid reaction battalions be disbanded. The agreement also provided for a truth commission that would take on the task of investigating serious acts of violence that had occurred since 1980 and whose impact on society urgently demands that the public should know the truth. The experts from the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Unit entered the country in February, and although the investigation was repeatedly stalled, the people of Morazan helped it along, among other things, by staging a boisterous demonstration in front of the Gotera courthouse in April, and so did the 3 truth commissioners when they arrived in June. Finally, in October, the experts began to dig, and there, on the 3rd day, in the silence of the ruined hamlet of El Mozote, all the words and claims and counterclaims that had been loudly made for nearly 11 years abruptly gave way before the mute force of material fact. The bones were there, the cartridges were there, the sleeping reality of El Mozote had finally been awoken. They dug and sifted and charted for 35 days, and soon the cartridges and the clothing and the bones and bone fragments, all labeled and packed away in bright manila envelopes and fresh new cartons, would depart El Mozote and travel by car to a laboratory in San Salvador, where the experts worked away into December. The following March, when the United Nations made public the Truth Commission's report entitled From Madness into Hope, the 12-year war in El Salvador, the analysis of the evidence was there, laid out for the reader in clear, precise language, each successive sentence demolishing one or another of the myths put forward during the previous 12 years. Of the 143 skulls found, all were deposited during the same temporal event, which is unlikely to have occurred later than 1981. El Mozote could not have been a guerrilla graveyard, as some had claimed, especially since all but 12 of the 143 remains identified turned out to be those of children under the age of 12, including at least one fetus found between the pelvic bones of one of the adults. The cartridges recovered in the sacristy showed that at least 24 people participated in the shooting, and the distribution of the shells indicated that they fired from within the house, from the doorway, and probably through a window to the right of the door. Finally, of the 245 cartridge cases that were studied, all but one from American M16 rifles, 184 had discernible head stamps identifying the ammunition as having been manufactured in the United States government at Lake City, Missouri. From the evidence and from a wealth of testimony, the Truth Commission would conclude that more than 500 identified victims perished at El Mozote and in the other villages. Many other victims have not been identified. To identify them would require more exhumations at other sites in El Mozote, as well as in La Jolla and other hamlets where the killing took place. But the Truth Commission has finished its report, and 5 days after the report was published, the Salvadoran legislature pushed through a blanket amnesty that would bar from prosecution those responsible for El Mozote and other atrocities of the Civil War. In view of this, Judge Portillo, after allowing 2 American anthropologists to work in the hamlet for several weeks with inclusive results, in effect closed down his investigation. The other victims of El Mozote will continue to lie undisturbed in the soul of Morazan. In July of 1993, the Secretary of State's panel on El Salvador, created in the wake of the Truth Commission report, concluded that the document's handling of the massacre investigation undermined the department's credibility with its critics, and probably with the Salvadorans, in a serious way that has not healed. The panel concluded its review by noting that a massacre had indeed occurred, and the U.S. statements on the case were wrong. On December the 11th, 1992, 2 embassy officers went to El Mozote to attend a ceremony honoring those who had died in the massacre. Only the Wall Street Journal remained more circumspect. In February, in a report from El Mozote on its editorial page entitled "The War's Over, but El Salvador Still Fights Propaganda Battle," the journal conceded that while it appears that a massacre of some kind took place, the questions remain, including the journal said, who were the true perpetrators of this awful crime. If you drive out from San Salvador today along the highway toward Morazan, bypassing the barracks of the Domingo Monterosa 3rd Brigade and crossing the narrow bridge on the Torola, its wooden planks clattering beneath your wheels, you will find amid sorghum and the corn and the tufts of maguey the clean new buildings of Segundo Montes, housing the boot factory and handicrafts shop and other factories brought back from the refugee camps. In one of the buildings, you will find the woman who fled La Jolla in 1981 was forced to bury her wounded child in the mountains, went mad, and became the witch of El Mozote that the villagers came to fear. Andrea Marquez works in the nursery caring for children of Segundo Montes. Farther up the Black Road, if you step through the barbed wire, you will find Rufina Amaya living in a small house with her little girl, Marta, who is now 4 years old. And if you head up the Black Road to Perkin, with its battered central square and its mural of the slain Archbishop Romero, you will come to Radio Venceremos, which has graduated from its various rows on the ground into an actual building on a nearby hill. Concrete, single story and small. It is a museum now. A gallery to exhibit pictures of the station's former subterranean quarters. Out in front, beside a well-preserved bomb crater with a carefully tended stone and flower border, and behind a brass plaque, you will find a dramatically twisted and burned torso of steel. As the people there will tell you, it is what remains of a helicopter that was blown from the sky one fine day, and it happens to be the most cherished monument in all Morazan. So yeah, that is the end of that chapter. I am looking through here because all that seems to be left is notes and the actual articles used. So I'm kind of browsing through this right quick, but that seems to be the majority of what's left, which we probably won't read that. Yeah, there's a lot of documents. Just looking through. The dead. It's got a list of those who died that was published. Geez, 400s, 500s, 600s, 700s, and that's the remainder of the book. Notes, the documents used, such as newspaper reports and stuff, and field reports, and the list of dead. That's what that remains. But yeah. So we won't go ahead and go through that. But yeah. Massacre at El Mozote. It's funny. Not funny. It's scary how much this reminds me of the U.S. backing Israel in its war with Hamas. Although, to be fair, it isn't a war on Hamas. it's actually a genocide on the Palestinians. They're already saying they want to move all Palestinians out of Gaza. Period. They've done mentioned this. And that's kind of how this shows America cannot keep its nose out of other countries. I've heard other people say, well, we're supposed to be the world's policeman. Who says? Who says? Is that not what the UN and NATO are for? But yeah. The Atlacatl try to perform one more act to make it seem as if it is the guerrillas who are doing all these atrocities. And of course, they don't succeed in that part of attempted propaganda when they tried to, or when they went ahead and slayed the Jesuits and stuff. So. Killed the Jesuits, their cook, and the cook's 15-year-old daughter. You know, instead of funding wars, funding revolutions, we need to be funding aid to improve things. But the problem is, so many companies here in the U.S. make money off of war. And again, the military industrial complex. War is big business. You've got these goons like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, the names you see over and over and over and over and over and over when it comes to building military weapons. And there's still more. These are just off the top of my head. Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing does some. And unfortunately, there's too many politicians on the national level that are beholden to these companies, or feel like they are, because they donate to their election campaigns. Honestly, I feel that all these military industrial complex companies, these companies of war, should be nationalized. Seriously. goodness knows how many companies feel like they should be autonomous of a nation and be able to move out to an international market and sell to whoever they wish. And suddenly you've got all these big weapons of war floating around. I mean, we've already got several countries with atomic bombs that are more than willing to say, I'll use my nuclear weapons. And as the case was here in El Salvador at El Mozote, there was no nuclear weapons. It was on the ground and personal. Bloody, brutal. It's just ridiculous. But we'll end this here, because I've kind of rambled on enough. Massacre at El Mozote. We'll be starting a new book next Tuesday. I'll have to dig through and see what I want to read. But, yeah. Yeah. Anyway. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.